The woods were always quiet at dusk, or so they thought. The gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, all the comforting sounds of nature that made the forest feel alive in the most peaceful way. But to anyone who truly listened, there was something else beneath the hum of the trees, an unnerving stillness that seemed to stretch far beyond the horizon. Amelia had always been drawn to the woods, especially during twilight. There was something otherworldly about the way the fading light bathed the forest in an eerie glow. She had heard the stories, the ones whispered by older kids around the campfires, but they never truly resonated with her. Slender Man? A tall, faceless figure who roamed the woods, stalking children in the dark. To Amelia, it was nothing more than a campfire story meant to spook the younger ones. But as she stood at the edge of the forest that evening, something felt off. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the birds that had mysteriously gone silent. It was the sense that the forest was watching her. She shook the thought from her mind and took a step forward, pushing through the underbrush. Her friends, Derek and Sophie, were already ahead of her, laughing and joking, unaware of the creeping unease that had settled in her chest. They were so carefree, so oblivious to the chill that had begun to creep into the air. Amelia had always prided herself on being the rational one of the group, but now, with every snap of a twig beneath her boots, the forest felt like it was alive, watching, waiting. "Come on, Amelia." Sophie's voice echoed from ahead, snapping Amelia from her thoughts. "You're falling behind." Amelia forced a smile, trying to shake off the dread that had taken root in her stomach. "Yeah, I'm coming," she called back, quickening her pace to catch up. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The path became harder to follow, the ground uneven and covered in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Amelia's heart began to race, her pulse quickening with every step. There was a sense of being drawn into something, an unseen force that tugged her further into the forest's heart. Derek turned back, his grin fading as he caught sight of her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. Amelia opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. It wasn't that she was scared, not really. It was just a feeling, an instinct she couldn't shake. She glanced around the dimming forest, her eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. And then she saw it. A tall figure, standing motionless just beyond the tree line. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the twisting branches overhead. But as her gaze lingered, the figure became clearer, unnaturally tall, unnervingly still. The figure was dressed in a black suit, its arms hanging at its sides, unnaturally long and thin. But the most terrifying thing about it wasn't its height, nor its strange, silent presence. It was its face. There was none. A smooth, featureless expanse where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth. Just a blank, haunting visage that seemed to stare directly into her soul. "Amelia?" Derek's voice broke through the haze of shock. "What's going on?" Amelia couldn't answer. She stood frozen, unable to look away from the figure. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening drum in her ears. The air around her felt heavier, the world suddenly narrowing until the only thing that existed was her, and the figure standing in the shadows. The forest fell deathly silent. Not even the wind dared to stir. And then, with a suddenness that made her gasp, the figure took a step forward. It was slow at first, almost deliberate, as though it was savoring the fear that radiated from her. Every movement was measured, unnatural, like a predator stalking its prey. "Run," Amelia whispered, but the words barely left her lips before the creature took another step, its limbs stretching in a way that made her stomach turn. Her legs finally moved, carrying her forward in a frantic dash toward her friends. But no matter how fast she ran, the feeling of being watched never left her. The air grew colder, and her breath began to mist in the chill. It was as though the figure was right behind her, breathing down her neck, its presence looming like a dark cloud over her every step. She called out to Derek and Sophie, but her voice was strangled, lost in the thickening silence. They turned to her, but before they could react, Amelia's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling to the ground. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure, now looming overhead, its long arms reaching down toward her in the shadows. Amelia awoke with a start, her breath sharp and shallow, her body cold and trembling. The forest was still around her, its oppressive silence pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She was lying on the ground, her head spinning, the pain in her knees and palms a sharp reminder of the fall. For a moment, she just lay there, trying to make sense of what had happened. What was that thing? Her pulse thudded in her ears as her eyes darted to the shadows of the trees. But the figure was gone. The tall, faceless monstrosity that had loomed over her moments ago had vanished without a trace, leaving only a chilling memory. Amelia pushed herself up, her body weak and unsteady, her legs shaking beneath her. "Amelia?" It was Sophie's voice, strained with concern, breaking the suffocating silence that enveloped the forest. Amelia turned to see her friend standing a few feet away, Derek holding Sophie back as she tried to push past him. They looked confused, scared, but there was something else, something in their eyes that she couldn't quite place. "What happened?" Derek asked, his voice wavering as he scanned her face. We heard you scream, but you weren't there. We turned around, and you were gone." Amelia opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. The terror of what she had seen, what she had felt, clung to her throat like a vice, suffocating her. She wanted to say something, anything, to ease their growing fear. But all she could manage was to point back toward the shadows. The thing, she gasped, her words catching in her throat. It was here." Sophie's face paled. She looked at Derek, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about? There's nothing here." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of unease in her tone that wasn't there before. Amelia's hands trembled as she stood, her fingers stiff and cold. She could still feel the presence of the figure, its gaze seeping into her bones, even though it was no longer there. A heavy dread settled in her stomach, a nauseating pull that whispered to her from the depths of the forest. She took a shaky step backward, eyes darting nervously to the trees around them. No, it's real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's real. We have to get out of here." Derek stepped forward, putting a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to steady her. But the gesture felt wrong somehow, too comforting, as if he couldn't understand the gravity of what she had just witnessed. "Come on, Amelia. You're freaked out, that's all. It's nothing but a story, an urban legend, nothing more." But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling. The figure had been real, The fear had been real. She could still feel its presence like an ice-cold hand pressing against her spine, like the suffocating grip of something ancient and malevolent that had been watching her for far longer than she could comprehend. It hadn't been an illusion or a bad dream. It was real, and it was waiting. "I'm not going back there," Amelia said, her voice firm, as she stepped further away from the dark shadows of the woods. Her heart was racing, her limbs stiff with dread. But it didn't matter. She couldn't go back, not with that thing still out there. Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, there was a sound, a low, hollow rustle from the woods. The air seemed to grow thicker as the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, unnatural whisper, as if the trees themselves were sighing in warning. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. Amelia's blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. No, this was something else. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Derek and Sophie froze. A long moment of silence passed, and then Sophie whispered, "Yeah, I heard it, but it's probably just an animal or something." The words hung in the air, but they didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of Amelia's neck prickled. The whispers grew louder, closer, almost as if they were moving toward them. And then, from somewhere deeper within the woods, a shadow shifted, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, and stretching far too long across the forest floor. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "It's him. It's here." Derek spun around, his eyes widening as he followed her gaze into the trees. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the tangled brush and the dying light of the setting sun. The shadows seemed to play tricks on their eyes, making everything appear distorted, unnervingly distant. "Stop," he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "You're scaring yourself. There's nothing out there. We're just lost, okay? We need to stay calm." But Amelia couldn't stay calm. She felt the terror wrap around her like a suffocating blanket, the cold fear that gripped her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel it. He was still out there, lurking just beyond the veil of the trees, watching, waiting. And she could sense that this time, he wasn't going to just disappear. Not this time. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble as a shadow shifted once more. A figure, tall, pale, and faceless, loomed from the darkness of the woods, its limbs stretching impossibly long, reaching toward them. Amelia screamed. Amelia's scream echoed through the trees, a high-pitched, gut-wrenching sound that tore through the suffocating stillness of the forest. The figure, that thing, was there, standing just beyond the line of trees, its pale, faceless form barely visible in the twilight. But it didn't need a face. It didn't need eyes. She could feel it looking at her, watching her every move with an unsettling, predatory focus. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if it might break free of her ribcage and flee from her body. She turned to run, but her legs refused to obey, frozen with terror. The thing was close now. She could hear the sound of its feet, if they could even be called feet, sliding against the forest floor, the noise eerily quiet, like a whispering breath on the wind. It was moving, gliding, and it was coming for her. Derek grabbed her arm with a force that almost felt like a lifeline. "Amelia, come on!" he shouted, his voice panicked, shaking her out of her trance. "We need to get out of here." She turned toward him, eyes wide, chest heaving. Her voice cracked as she tried to form words. It's behind us. It's here. But Derek only glanced at her, wide-eyed, before his gaze darted back to the woods. There was nothing there. No towering, faceless figure. No malevolent presence in the trees. "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded, his face pale in the dying light. "There's nothing there. You're imagining things." Amelia could hardly breathe. The figure had vanished, but the horror of it, the chill that had seeped into her very bones, lingered in the air. It's out there. It's real. She knew it, just as sure as the earth was beneath her feet. The world around her seemed to pulse with dread, a slow, suffocating rhythm that matched the frantic beat of her heart. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, twisting the branches into grotesque shapes. The sky had grown darker, the once welcoming twilight now thick with an oppressive gloom. Everything felt wrong. "Derek, we need to leave," Amelia whispered, a desperate tremor in her voice. "Now." But Derek shook his head, dismissing her words, his frustration evident. "Stop. We're not going anywhere until we figure this out. There's no monster in the woods, okay? Just calm down. We'll find a way back to the path." Sophie, who had been standing off to the side, now looked nervously toward the thickening shadows. "Maybe we should listen to her," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. "I mean, something feels off. I don't like this place anymore." Amelia didn't wait for anyone to respond. She turned and began walking, her pace quickening to a near run, her eyes scanning the trees around them, desperately searching for any sign of the thing. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it, its presence pressing down on her like a weight too heavy to bear. As she stumbled through the underbrush, her mind raced. The Slender Man. It had to be. The way the stories always told it, always warned of it, said that it never left its victims. It followed them. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, it always stayed one step ahead, silently watching, silently waiting. Her pulse quickened as she realized something she hadn't considered before. She wasn't just running away from the woods. She wasn't just running from the creature. She was being hunted. The realization hit her like a wave, cold and suffocating. She had thought she could escape, but in the moment when she had seen the Slender Man, when her mind had fully comprehended its existence, she had sealed her fate. Now, there was no escape. It wasn't just the forest she had to outrun. It was the terror, the shadow, the silence that trailed behind her. "Amelia," Derek shouted, finally catching up to her as she stumbled through the underbrush. "Stop. You need to calm down." But she couldn't calm down. She was already far beyond fear. She was beyond logic, beyond reason. The woods were too quiet, too still. Every step she took felt like it was leading her deeper into a nightmare, but she couldn't stop herself. Her legs moved on their own, driven by the primal urge to flee from the terror that nipped at her heels. The wind howled again, louder this time, and for a brief moment, Amelia could have sworn she heard a low, inhuman sound carried on the breeze, a sound that wasn't the wind at all. She spun around, her eyes searching the trees again, and there it was, standing just behind them, at the edge of their sight. The figure, impossibly tall, impossibly still, watching them with its faceless, soulless gaze. But this time, it was different. The figure was moving closer. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, creeping forward with terrifying precision. No sound, no warning. It was simply there, looming in the distance, its presence radiating from the shadows like a cold, suffocating fog. "No!" Amelia screamed, turning and running faster than she ever had in her life. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she pushed herself harder, faster. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The very thought of seeing its faceless gaze once more paralyzed her with fear. But despite her frantic pace, she knew. It knew she was running. And it wasn't letting her go. Amelia's breath came in frantic bursts as she tore through the underbrush, her shoes slipping on the damp earth. Every branch, every rustle of leaves seemed to whisper the same thing. It's behind you. It's always behind you. The world around her had twisted into something unnatural. The once familiar forest, now an unrecognizable maze of shadows and dark shapes. Behind her, the others were struggling to keep up, their calls faint, swallowed by the oppressive gloom of the trees. Sophie's voice cracked in the distance. "Amelia, wait, you're going too fast." But Amelia couldn't wait. She couldn't stop. The air was thick with dread, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her mind reeled from the realization that the slender man had been following them. No matter how much she ran, no matter how far she fled, it was always one step behind, an insidious presence creeping closer with every passing second. The trees around her closed in, their gnarled branches seeming to twist toward her, like the fingers of some ancient, malevolent force. Amelia's legs burned with exhaustion, her lungs aching with each desperate gasp for air, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. Not when she could feel the oppressive weight of that gaze on her back. The thing was still there, just behind the line of trees, always lurking at the edges of her vision. Suddenly, a sound. A low, guttural growl, barely a whisper in the air. It sent a chill down Amelia's spine, colder than any wind could have been. She froze, every muscle in her body seizing in terror. It wasn't the wind. No, it was something else. Something alive. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but saw nothing in the thickening shadows. The forest was silent again, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she strained to listen. There it was again, a faint rustling, too rhythmic to be an animal. It was the sound of something, or someone, moving with purpose, something that had learned the art of hunting. Amelia could hear the soft scrape of its limbs against the bark of trees, its every movement deliberate and unnervingly quiet. It's close. The thought slammed into her like a wave. It was closer than before. She could feel the trees around her, their branches reaching out like arms, as if trying to protect her from the thing lurking in the darkness. The sound grew louder, and then nothing. Absolute silence. A hand gripped her shoulder, and she let out a shrill scream, whirling around to face it. But it was only Derek. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Amelia, stop! We have to—" Before he could finish, something tore through the trees in a blur of movement, tall, thin, and impossibly fast. The air turned ice cold in an instant, and Amelia's stomach twisted as a shadow loomed over them. It was there, the slender man. The figure stood at the edge of their vision, impossibly tall and distorted, its limbs stretching toward them, too long, too wrong. Its body was devoid of any features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless face that was both terrifying and utterly alien. The faint rustling sound they had heard moments earlier had been its limbs sliding across the trees, its quiet advance a chilling prelude to the nightmare that had finally caught up with them. Amelia stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. "Run!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Run!" But Derek didn't move. His eyes were locked on the figure, as if mesmerized by it, as though the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing had frozen him in place. Sophie screamed, her voice high-pitched with fear, but it was as though the sound didn't reach Derek. He stood there, motionless, his face pale and slack. "Derek, move!" Amelia shouted again, her heart pounding in her chest. But it was too late. The slender man's long, unnaturally thin limbs reached out toward Derek with horrifying speed. There was no sound, no cry of pain, just a sickening, unnatural silence as the creature enveloped him with its dark presence. Amelia could barely comprehend what she was seeing. The slender man's limbs curled around Derek, folding and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. In an instant, he was swallowed by the darkness. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred as she backed away, her legs weak, her body paralyzed by fear. But Sophie was screaming now too, her voice shrill with panic. "No!" Sophie's voice cracked. "Derek!" But Derek didn't respond. No one did. The slender man stood motionless for a moment, its limbs stretching unnaturally far, as though savoring the fear in the air. Then, as if it had achieved its goal, it simply vanished. The trees seemed to close up around it, as if the creature had never been there at all. The forest fell into a heavy silence, too still, too quiet. Amelia was left breathless, her mind spinning, her body trembling. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But it was. Sophie grabbed her arm, her face ashen with terror. "What do we do? What do we do now?" Amelia could barely think. The thing had taken Derek, just taken him, without a sound. The fear, the horror, the certainty of their doom, all of it weighed heavily on her chest. They couldn't run. There was nowhere to hide. The forest, the thing, it would always be with them, following, waiting, hunting. And as much as Amelia wanted to deny it, she knew deep down there was only one way this would end. In the dead of the night, in the heart of the woods, she could hear the faintest whisper in the wind. A voice, soft and cold as a death rattle. "You cannot escape." Amelia's mind was a haze of dread. Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled through the forest, Sophie beside her, both of them barely able to comprehend what had just transpired. Derek was gone. One moment he had been standing there, frozen in fear, and the next he had been swallowed by the darkness. The slender man's tall, formless figure had taken him without a sound, without a trace. "Derek," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling as if saying his name would somehow bring him back. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, as though she expected him to jump out from behind a tree any second, his expression confused and shocked. But no, nothing came. The woods were as quiet as a tomb. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves beneath their feet. "We have to get out of here," Amelia managed, her voice rough and strained, though the words seemed to lose their meaning in the stillness that surrounded them. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape. But where? There was no escape. The woods had become a maze, every direction just as dangerous as the last. And in every shadow, in every shifting of branches, she could feel it. The eyes of the slender man, watching, waiting. Sophie was walking faster now, her steps frantic, her face pale and drawn with terror. "What was that thing? What is it? What do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Amelia shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't know what to say. She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that the creature, thing, had taken Derek. It had come from the depths of the woods, from a place where nightmares lived and breathed. And now it was coming for them too. A low moan, distant but unmistakable, echoed through the trees. Amelia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a voice. A whisper that was not meant to be heard by human ears. Did you hear that? Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting nervously, as if expecting the trees themselves to come alive. Amelia nodded, her stomach twisting. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a disembodied sound that sent waves of unease rippling through her body. It was as if the forest itself was alive, responding to their presence, drawing them deeper into its sinister grasp. And then there it was again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of something shifting, moving through the underbrush, something large. Amelia turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the trees. Her eyes searched frantically, but she saw nothing, only the shifting shadows of the darkening woods. It was then that she heard it, a whisper, barely audible at first, but unmistakably clear now. "I'm watching you." A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine. She spun around to face Sophie, who had stopped, her eyes wide and terrified, her body trembling as she stared into the gloom. "What is it?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile thread of sanity they were clinging to. Amelia didn't answer. She couldn't. The words caught in her throat. The voice, no, the presence, it was all around them, in the trees, in the air. It wasn't just the slender man. It was something older, something far more ancient, and it was playing with them, drawing them in, making them its prey. The woods around them grew colder. The air became thick and stifling, and the distant sound of wind through the branches was replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness. It was as if the world itself had stopped turning. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, the trees began to shift. The shadows lengthened, twisting and writhing as if alive. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and Amelia's heart raced as she realized what was happening. "Run!" she breathed, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her into motion. But Sophie hesitated, her eyes still fixed on the shifting shadows. "It's not real. It can't be real," she muttered, her voice unsteady. "It's real," Amelia said through clenched teeth. "It's all real. We have to go now." But it was too late. The ground beneath them groaned as though it were alive, the air thick with an unseen force that pressed against their lungs. The trees closed in around them, their branches twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes, reaching for them with long, spindly fingers. A sharp crack broke the stillness, and Amelia spun around just in time to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a towering shape that seemed to stretch impossibly high into the dark sky. The slender man. Its body was a mass of inky darkness, its limbs long and spindly, moving in unnatural jerks as though it was not quite human. Its face, if you could call it that, was smooth, featureless, a void of horror. "Run!" Amelia screamed, her heart pounding in her chest as she pulled Sophie forward. But it was no use. The slender man had already begun to move toward them, its body distorting and stretching, its limbs reaching out to grab them. The air became thick, suffocating, as the creature closed in on them. Its cold presence washed over them, numbing their bodies, freezing their minds. And in that moment, Amelia realized with sickening clarity there was no escape. There never had been. The world had become a blur, a frenzied whirlwind of shifting shadows and crushing fear. Amelia's legs burned as she dragged Sophie through the thick, unyielding forest. Every snap of a twig beneath their feet seemed to echo through the night, a deafening reminder of the unseen terror pursuing them. The Slender Man. He was close. They could feel it in their bones, a suffocating presence pressing against their skin, seeping into their minds like a poison. His footsteps, or rather, the lack of them, made the pursuit all the more terrifying. There was no sound, no sign of his movement, but every so often, Amelia would catch a glimpse of that tall, looming figure out of the corner of her eye. Just the faintest distortion in the dark, like a shadow in the periphery. It was always there, always just out of sight, a haunting reminder that they were never truly alone. Sophie stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and Amelia yanked her back upright. "Come on, Sophie, we can't stop. We have to keep moving." Sophie looked up at her face pale and her eyes wild with fear. "Amelia, I can't keep running. It's too much. I don't know how much more I can take." Her voice cracked, the raw panic evident in every word. Amelia's heart clenched as she looked at her friend, but there was no time to comfort her. They didn't have time for anything. "We can make it," she said, though the words felt hollow, even to her. "We just have to stay ahead of him. We can make it through the woods. We have to." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, an inescapable labyrinth of trees, and no matter how far they ran, the Slender Man was always there, just out of sight, always watching, always following. Every breath, every step, was a countdown to the inevitable. Suddenly, Sophie cried out, her voice high-pitched with terror. Amelia spun around, heart leaping into her throat. Sophie had stopped, her eyes wide with panic. "Amelia, look!" Sophie pointed shakily ahead, her body trembling. Amelia followed the line of her finger, and for the first time, she saw him in full. The Slender Man stood at the edge of the clearing, his impossibly long arms reaching out like tendrils of darkness. His face was featureless, smooth as an unmarked canvas, but his presence was so overwhelming that it felt like the very air was being sucked out of the space. His body seemed to flicker in and out of the shadows, as if he was a part of the night itself, blending with the darkness. Amelia's blood ran cold. She had heard the stories, read the warnings, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer terror of facing him, truly facing him. The Slender Man moved, not in steps, but as though he simply was there one moment and then was somewhere else the next, as though the very fabric of space bent around him. "No!" Amelia screamed, grabbing Sophie's wrist and pulling her into motion once again. "We need to move now!" But Sophie stood frozen, her eyes locked on the Slender Man. "Amelia, he's not moving. He's watching us." The Slender Man did not need to move. The very act of his presence was enough to paralyze them, to make their limbs heavy and their minds clouded. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating them, and the world around them seemed to warp. With a sickening twist in her stomach, Amelia realized something that made her blood run colder than ever. The Slender Man wasn't chasing them. He didn't need to. He was toying with them, letting them run in circles, driving them deeper into his grasp. "Run!" Amelia shouted, pulling Sophie again, this time with desperate strength. They pushed through the dense underbrush, their breath ragged, their limbs aching. But still, the forest pressed in around them. The trees seemed to close in tighter, as if the very woods themselves were alive, conspiring with the slender man to trap them. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, was a sound that sent a new jolt of terror through Amelia's spine. Every shadow seemed to shift, as if it could be the creature's long-reaching limbs stretching towards them. And then, just as the panic began to reach its peak, it happened. The air grew heavier, colder. The woods fell completely silent. For the first time they heard nothing. Not the wind, not the rustling of leaves. Nothing. It was then that the true horror began. The trees around them began to twist and contort in unnatural ways, their trunks stretching and bending like the limbs of something not quite human. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, crawled through the silence. "You cannot hide." Amelia's heart leapt to her throat as the trees closed in around them, their limbs reaching toward her, pulling her deeper into the forest. Panic gripped her chest as she screamed, struggling to break free from the suffocating hold of the trees. Sophie screamed too, her voice piercing the silence as they were both engulfed by the creeping darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whispering ceased. The trees ceased their unnatural movements. But the slender man was no longer in the clearing. The silence was broken by a cold laugh, distant yet terrifying, echoing around them. They had no idea where he was or what he would do next. But they knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to survive this. Amelia's heart hammered in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears as the eerie, bone-chilling laugh reverberated through the trees. The cold air wrapped around her, seeping deep into her bones, freezing her in place. Sophie clung to her, her fingers trembling, her breaths shallow and rapid. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still, time itself holding its breath, waiting. The silence felt like it would suffocate them, and yet, in that silence, Amelia could hear something else. A sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was the whisper of something dragging through the forest floor, a faint, rhythmic scraping. The slender man. His presence was suffocating, oppressive. Amelia's mind raced, but there were no answers, only the overwhelming urge to run. Her body screamed for movement, but her legs refused to cooperate, as if the air itself had become thick with dread, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. "Sophie, we have to," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. But as her eyes scanned the clearing, she realized the terrifying truth. They were surrounded. The trees had closed in so tightly that it was impossible to see any escape. The path they had been following was now completely obscured, swallowed by the dense forest. Sophie's eyes were wide with terror, her face pale as a sheet. She glanced around frantically, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. "Amelia, what do we do? He's everywhere." The words hung in the air like an omen, and for the briefest of moments, Amelia almost believed Sophie was right. The very fabric of the forest seemed to warp, bending around them, distorting reality. The trees, the shadows, the very ground beneath their feet, they all felt wrong, as if they were part of the creature's domain, manipulated and shaped by his will. And then there was a sound, a scraping noise, much closer now. The whispering wind seemed to carry it, a soft, sickening sound as though something long and jagged was dragging itself through the leaves and underbrush. Amelia turned her head in every direction, but it was everywhere, coming from all sides. Suddenly, without warning, the trees began to move. Branches, impossibly long and twisted, began to reach out from the darkness. They stretched toward them, each movement deliberate, as though they were alive, sentient, pulling them deeper into the shadows. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in desperate gasps as she tried to wrench Sophie away from the encroaching branches. "We have to move," Amelia screamed, tugging Sophie forward. But it was like dragging her through thick mud. Sophie's feet dragged, her body limp with terror. But just as Amelia was about to force her to keep going, the ground beneath them shifted. The earth trembled, and the trees that surrounded them groaned and twisted, the branches curving in unnatural ways. Amelia stumbled, her ankle giving way beneath her as she collapsed to the ground, dragging Sophie with her. A low, guttural noise filled the air, like something scraping across the stone. Amelia's blood ran cold. She looked up through the darkened trees and saw it. The slender man. He was there, towering above them, his long, unnaturally pale limbs extending toward the sky, stretching impossibly far. His featureless face, an empty void, stared down at them. There was no expression, no emotion, just the eerie, soul-shattering absence that seemed to swallow the very light around him. His body flickered in and out of the shadows, his presence a ghostly distortion in the air. Amelia's mind screamed at her to move, but her body refused to respond. The sight of him paralyzed her, a primal terror locking her in place. And then he moved. Slowly, methodically, his limbs extended with inhuman precision. One arm stretched out toward Sophie, who had frozen beside Amelia, her eyes wide with uncomprehending fear. Amelia felt a surge of panic that pushed her into action. She grabbed Sophie's wrist with shaking hands, pulling her toward the trees, toward the only chance they had left. They had to escape. They couldn't let him catch them. But as they ran, the very earth beneath them seemed to shift, and the trees reached down like fingers, scraping the ground as though trying to hold them in place. The slender man didn't move in the traditional sense. He didn't walk or run. He was the forest, and with every step they took, it felt as though the entire landscape was bending toward him. Amelia glanced back, terrified to see if they had lost him. But there he was, his form flickering in and out of existence like a nightmare made flesh. The slender man was everywhere, behind them, ahead of them, in the spaces they couldn't see. His long, thin limbs stretched through the forest like tendrils, reaching for them, but never quite touching. "Amelia," Sophie gasped, her voice barely a whisper. He's... Amelia didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to know what Sophie was about to say because they both knew the truth. There was no escape. The slender man was toying with them, guiding them deeper into his labyrinth of twisted trees and shadows. He was relentless, patient, and he wouldn't stop until he had them. Then it happened. The world around them seemed to collapse, folding inward like a collapsing star. The darkness took on a new form, its own heartbeat. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them, an overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to tear them apart from the inside out. Amelia could feel it. He was close, closer than ever before. The walls of the forest closed in on them, squeezing the breath from their lungs. The slender man was coming for them, and nothing would save them from his grasp. Amelia's mind raced as her heart hammered painfully in her chest. Every breath she took felt as though it could be her last, each inhale thick with terror, each exhale tremulous and ragged. The trees surrounding her swayed unnaturally, groaning like ancient forgotten beings, and the very air seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. The slender man was drawing closer, his presence suffocating, wrapping around her like a vice. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even though his featureless face remained hidden in the shadows. It was as if his very essence was pressing down on her soul. Sophie stumbled beside her, her legs shaky, her breaths shallow and rapid. She was no longer speaking, hadn't spoken in what felt like hours, but Amelia could feel her fear like a palpable thing, vibrating in the very air they breathed. The forest was alive with it. With every step they took, the trees seemed to grow taller and more twisted, their limbs stretching out like claws, eager to ensnare them. The deeper they went into the heart of the woods, the darker it became, as if the sun had abandoned the world entirely. The slender man was patient. She could sense that, and it made her blood run cold. He was never in a hurry, never rushing. He simply waited. His long limbs flickered in and out of existence between the shadows, a faint distortion in the air that made it impossible to tell where he truly was. He was everywhere, and nowhere. And the worst part? Amelia knew that he was watching, always watching. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I can't let him have us. Not like this." The woods seemed to close in around them, the darkness creeping in from all sides. Every way they turned, there was no escape. The path ahead was a dead end, the trees too thick to break through, the shadows too oppressive. Amelia turned back to look at Sophie, her hand shaking as she gripped her friend's wrist tightly, trying to reassure her. "We need to keep moving," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens, don't let go of my hand." Sophie nodded, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror, but she said nothing. The silence between them was deafening, thick with the sense of impending doom. They moved together, slow steps through the darkness, each footfall echoing in the stillness, a mournful reminder that their time was running out. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook violently, and Amelia gasped, falling to her knees. The trees around them began to bend and groan, as if something deep within the earth was pulling them all towards some unseen force. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something long dead and forgotten. And in that moment, Amelia knew the truth. There was no way out. The slender man was everywhere, his presence all-encompassing. His shadow seemed to loom over them, growing larger, darker, consuming everything in its path. And then, as if to solidify his dominance over the forest, the world around them flickered. One brief, impossible instant when the trees, the ground, and the very sky twisted and distorted. And there, standing in the center of the forest, was the slender man. He was taller than ever before, impossibly tall, his limbs stretching far beyond what was natural. His body seemed to shift and bend unnaturally, flickering in and out of the shadows like a wraith. His pale, featureless face stared down at them, his hollow eyes empty and cold. The very air seemed to grow heavy as his presence pressed down on them like a vice. Amelia could feel it now, the pull. It was like gravity itself had shifted, drawing her toward him. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but her body refused to move. She could feel Sophie trembling beside her. the girl's breath ragged as she too struggled against the invisible force that seemed to hold them captive. The slender man extended one long, gnarled arm toward them, his fingers stretching unnaturally, like the branches of the trees themselves. The air hummed with a sickening energy, and Amelia felt the earth beneath her tremble with the force of his power. It was too late. She couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how far she ran, the slender man was always there, just out of reach but never far enough. He was everywhere, and she had led Sophie straight into his trap. As his fingers reached toward them, Amelia felt an overwhelming sense of cold wash over her. It was an unnatural cold, one that seeped into her very bones, freezing her from the inside out. She couldn't feel her legs anymore, couldn't feel her arms. The world around her blurred, the shadows swallowing her whole. And then, everything stopped. For a brief, breathless moment, the world was still. The slender man loomed over them, but he no longer moved. His presence seemed to hang in the air, a suffocating weight that stole the breath from their lungs. The woods, once alive with the sounds of the night, fell into a deadly silence. Amelia couldn't move. She couldn't even blink. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Sophie's face, pale, terrified, and completely still, as if time had frozen for them both. And then there was nothing. And so, the chilling tale of the slender man draws to a close. The darkness that enveloped Amelia and Sophie reminds us of the terror that hides just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. The slender man, a creature born of shadows and whispers, has once again claimed his victims, leaving behind nothing but silence in his wake. If you felt the chill of his presence tonight, remember to stay vigilant. Keep your lights on and your doors locked. For in the quiet corners of the world, creatures like the slender man still lurk, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more spine-chilling tales. Until next time, sleep tight, and never wander too far from the light.